Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents State by State, a panoramic portrait of America. 50 writers on 50 states. Edited by Matt Weiland and Sean Wilsey. Narrated by Michael Butler Murray and Tanya E.B. Preface. Matt Weiland. This book started with a hunch and a conviction. The conviction was the easy part, that despite drive-time radio and the nightly news and the Sunday paper, despite all the books and blog posts, the documentaries and songs, America and the lives lived here remains strangely and surprisingly underdescribed. So many mirrors, and yet we know ourselves so poorly. Often it takes a tragedy to remind us so. When residents of the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans stand dazed on their rooftops, wondering why the floodwater came so fast and the drinking water so slow. When coal miners are rescued in West Virginia or entombed in Utah. When the lives of cleaners and brokers, accountants and firemen are memorialized after September 11th. Who hasn't marveled at the richness of lives we don't know? The same is true of the landscape and the past we've lived across it. The topography and climate of America may be the richest in the world. Yet what ends up on the page so rarely seems to capture its dynamism, its variety, its intensity. Sure, the deepest canyons and the wettest waterfalls and the curviest roads make cameos and ads for automobiles and soda pop and life insurance. And plenty of stories, fictional and true, are set in the streets and skylines of our principal cities. But what about everywhere else? The half-dead towns too alive to be ghosts. The rusting historical markers buried in the weeds. The anonymous bits of land with their own hidden histories and surprising beauties and grace. There is poetry in the Rand McNally Atlas, and wonder in the back rooms and basements of 1,000 local archives and historical societies. But all too often, it seems trapped there. Somehow we've come to take for granted what our country looks like, what happened here, and what it feels like to live here. Shouldn't we know it all in finer detail? The hunch was less obvious, but the more we thought about it, the more convinced we became of its truth. It was this, that America, for all its bland interstate highways and big-box superstores, retains an essential deep-grained variety. No one doubts that America is growing more homogeneous with each passing year. Go from one time zone to another, and the increasing sameness of everywhere is plain. One city blurs into another. The same architects build the same buildings. The same stores line the same streets. The same songs play on the radio. Regional accents fade. And everyone seems to be from somewhere else. And yet, the 50 states, united by rhetoric and musket nearly 250 years ago, reaffirmed in their unity by rhetoric and rifle a century later, and bound together today as tightly as any confederation on earth, somehow stubbornly resist blending into a single undifferentiated whole. The 50 states differ in landscape, topography, and weather, in political outlook, cultural preference, and social ideals, in accent, temperament, and sense of humor. It's not just that the West Coast is a world away from the East, that Yankees stick out in the South, or that blue states and red states don't see eye to eye. It's deeper than that. The 50 states themselves have individual places in our collective imagination, and they offer their natives a mindset, even a worldview. For all the talk of identity in American life, the personal fact that defines American lives as much as gender, ethnicity, or class is where you're from, which more than anything means your home state. Sean Wilsey and I started talking about all this last year, just as I was moving back to America after 4 years of living abroad. I was hitting the Americana hard. I read Moby Dick and Huck Finn again, and I gorged on Preston Sturges films and Will Eisner comics and the aching old-time music that is heavy on banjos and beards. I spent a long Sunday walking down Broadway and a weekend bicycling on the Jersey Shore and a week driving 3,000 miles through the Midwest. I ate a whole lot of pie. I was reveling in what the poet Delmore Schwartz called the beautiful American word, sure, and growing obsessed with the vibrancy and individuality of the American states. I told more than one person that I thought the Indian mounds of Ohio were deeply, profoundly fascinating, that the glories of the Nevada desert remained shockingly unsung, that I wanted a long, slow bus ride in the wake of Sherman's march through Georgia, or along the Great Western Cattle Trail from Texas through Oklahoma and Kansas. I don't know what I was after, exactly, except to experience again some simple American virtues, the essential looseness of American lives, the vitality and variety of American vistas, the cut and jib of American talk. The more Sean and I talked about it, the more we wanted to know the details. What makes one state different from another? What are each state's peculiarities and idiosyncrasies, their prejudices and biases, their beauty marks and moles, their cadences and jokes? We knew we couldn't find out everything. Who could possibly be comprehensive about their own household, let alone an entire state? But couldn't we put together a book that captures something essential, something fundamental and distinctive about each state? We wanted something broad-minded and good-hearted, something bold, intimate, and funny, something full of personal anecdote and strange characters and hidden truths. What we wanted, we realized, was a road trip in book form. Who better to turn to than our finest novelists and reporters? Such a project had been done before on a much grander scale. The WPA American Guide series of the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. As part of the New Deal, the Federal Writers Project put more than 6,000 American writers, archivists, and researchers back to work, creating a vivid, detailed, and lasting portrait of America at the time. Some of the finest writers in the country worked for the project, including Conrad Aiken, Nelson Algren, Saul Bellow, Arna Bontemps, John Cheever, Jack Conroy, Edward Dahlberg, Ralph Ellison, Zora Neale Hurston, David Ignatow, Meridel Lesueur, Kenneth Rexroth, Wallace Stegner, Studs Terkel, and Richard Wright. The project produced hundreds of books and pamphlets, including guides to dozens of major cities, as well as to interstates and regions. US 1, the Oregon Trail, the Arrowhead of Minnesota, Here's New England. The project also gathered oral histories, slave narratives, recordings of folk songs, and collections of folklore and social history. The Italians of Omaha, the Negro in New York, baseball in old Chicago, who's who in the zoo. But the crowning achievement of the Federal Writers Project was the creation of the state guides, taking as their mantra to describe America to Americans. These books documented the 48 states of the time in unprecedented detail and with great charm. Each guide ran more than 500 pages and featured original unsigned essays on a state's history, its literature and art, its architecture and public transportation, its flora and fauna, its industry and agriculture. Many included essays on topics unique to each state as well, on the movie industry in California and dairy farming in Wisconsin, on marine lore in Michigan and tall tales in Oregon, on arts and crafts in Arizona, and cuisine in Louisiana, on mining jargon in Nevada and Chinook words in Alaska, on Abraham Lincoln in Illinois and Daniel Boone in Kentucky. Each guide also featured detailed descriptions of that state's major cities and towns, maps and guided tours of each state's principal monuments and attractions, and a section of original photographs, too. Eudora Welty took photos for the Mississippi Guide. Ben Shahn took ones for Ohio. It was an extraordinarily ambitious project, guided by the will to describe, by intrepid curiosity, by raw idealism, and by a reinvigorated sense of national pride even at the depths of the Depression. Writers, critics, and historians of the time hailed it as a landmark undertaking. John Steinbeck called the state guides the most comprehensive account of the United States ever got together by the best writers in America. To Lewis Mumford, They were the finest contribution to American patriotism that has been made in our generation. And Alfred Kazin said they constituted an extraordinary epic. Out of the great storehouse of facts behind the guides, geological, geographic, meteorological, ethnological, historical, political, sociological, economic, there emerged an America unexampled in density and regional diversity. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave the project an encomium, though he wasn't at his fireside chattiest when he said of the guides that they ably illustrate our national way of life, yet at the same time portray variance in local patterns of living and regional development. Still, he was right. The BBC reporter Alistair Cook was looser-lipped when he wrote to the director of the Federal Writers Project in 1939, "I hope to buy, beg, steal, annex, or protect a complete library of the guides before I die." He did, and with their model in mind, he set off on a cross-country reporting road trip for the BBC in 1941. The result is the recently discovered manuscript published as The American Homefront, 1941 to 1942. But for all that, the Federal Writers Project wasn't perfect. It was racked by a Red Scare that tagged its underlying ideals and practical commitments as communist propaganda, and it was riven by an ongoing argument over which writers federal money should be used to support, the most indigent or the most talented. This latter argument was reflected in the fact that some of the guides suffer from leaden prose and read as though they were written by committee, which was often the case. John Cheever, who was an editor on the WPA Guide to New York City, bitterly described his job as twisting into order the sentences written by some incredibly lazy bastards. The WPA Guides were also conceived as guidebooks, which meant that for all their charm and information, they were too anonymous, too stiff, and too formulaic for what Sean and I had in mind. So though we wanted to make a book inspired by the ideals behind the WPA Guides and the lore and telling details within them, we also wanted something more personal, more eccentric, and more partial. And, lacking the $27 million that the United States government poured into the Federal Writers Project, we envisioned a single book rather than 1,000, this one featuring a different writer for each of the 50 states. Others over the years have had a similar idea, and we looked to them for inspiration too. The underappreciated journalist John Gunther's monumental Inside USA, 1947. The anthology of fiction set in each state called U.S. Stories, 1949. Neil R. Pierce and Jerry Hagstrom's astoundingly informative Book of America, Inside 50 States Today, 1983. The stylish series of pieces on each state that John Leonard edited for The Nation in 2002. We also looked to the wry charm of radio programs like Garrison Keillor's A Prairie Home Companion, Ira Glass's This American Life, and Michael Feldman's What Do You Know, as well as the travel writings of Calvin Trillin, Ian Frazier, and Roy Blunt Jr., and the songwriter Sufjan Stevens's quixotic project to record an album devoted to each of the 50 states. So one spring day in Manhattan, Sean and I huddled in a booth at the Old Town Bar to sort out a plan. First, we agreed that we didn't want the pieces to be victory laps for writers known for writing about a particular state. We have loved and learned from, for example, Joan Didion on California, Carl Hyacin on Florida, Garrison Keillor on Minnesota, and Larry McMurtry on Texas. But you won't find them here. We wanted some pieces by writers native to a particular state, of course, but we also wanted some by newcomers, and others by writers we'd send to states they'd never been to get a sense of the place as only a writer with a map and fresh eyes and a deadline can get. Second, we agreed that we didn't want the book to become a kind of beauty contest full of partisan arguments for the superiority of one's own state. We wanted the good, the bad, the ugly. Third, we wanted the book to go beyond personal history. So we sought out and commissioned travel accounts, historical essays, contemporary reportage, and works of oral history. To everyone we said, tell us a story about your state. The more personal, the better. Something that captures the essence of the place. Not the kind of story one hears in a musty lecture hall or one reads in the dusty pages of an encyclopedia. The kind of story the enlisted soldier tells his boot camp bunkmate about back home. The kind of story, wistful and wise, that begins, "Well, I don't know about you, but where I come from." With a map of America and a list of a couple hundred of our favorite writers before us, we started to seek out writers to tell us something we didn't know. I don't think it does any discredit to the writers here to say that others we asked declined our invitation. John Updike felt his knowledge of the place we asked him to write about was too rooted in the past for the task at hand. Don DeLillo preferred to write about what originated in his own dim interior. J.D. Salinger stayed silent. Other responses were disappointing, but helpful in stirring our resolve. Richard Ford pointed to the danger of superficiality. Quite right, we thought, and one we've strived hard to avoid. Always prodding our writers to get out of their own skin, to write about ways their own experience was informed by that of others. Roger Angell was dubious about our hunch. I would guess that a lot of the strong regionalism that was around in the 1930s has been wiped away, flattened by interstates and TV and by whole generations leaving home as fast as they can. Too true. And all the more reason to plow ahead, we thought, and see what particular local remains. Angell also mentioned that he remembered the WPA books pretty well. The authors were inflamed by the concept, and most of all by being paid money to write. Our authors were inflamed, but whether it was by the concept or the money, I'm not sure. Some, it's true, took some convincing. I'm pretty sure we promised a beer and a bump to every writer in the book, and the carton of frozen orange juice that Sean mailed to William T. Vollmann, long story, likely has the Department of Homeland Security on our trail. But the simple truth is that everyone responded with enthusiasm and gusto, even without, or anyway before, the juice and whiskey. 3 writers even vied for the privilege of writing about New Jersey. In the end, we assembled a mix of novelists, reporters, cartoonists, a cook, a playwright, a filmmaker, and a musician. Their pieces total more than 200,000 words. What would someone who has never been to America make of it from their work? Perhaps she would detect a robust ambivalence about home, the kind of deep and nuanced patriotism, I'd say, that can only come from knowing your country's past and having faith in its future. Perhaps she'd note a prevalence of that singular American trait of buoyancy, an energetic warmth and open-mindedness, as well as a surprising obsession with bumper stickers, Native Americans, and Walmart. And I imagine she'd notice a strong sense of renewal, of the great flux and energy that new waves of immigrants bring, as the pieces about Bosnians in Missouri, Chinese in Georgia, Mexicans in Iowa, and at least one Ghanaian in Michigan make plain. But for my part, in reading state by state, I'm just glad to have gone to some interesting places. Some are well known, like the Civil War battlefield at Shiloh, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, the Alamo, Roswell, the headquarters of the IRS, the parking lot at Mount Rushmore, John James Audubon's house in Hendersonville, Kentucky, and Mark Twain's boyhood home in Hannibal, Missouri. Others are more anonymous, but no less significant in their way. A pawn shop in Las Vegas, a roadhouse in Wichita, an S&M club in San Francisco, a diner in Key West. And I'm glad to have learned something. I now know how to ditch ski, and how to make a good tortilla, how a salmon gets caught, and how a hog has sex. Loudly. I know to ask for buttermilk pie in Texas, mint candy in Indiana, a Christmas kringle in Wisconsin, and a traveler in South Carolina. I know who youpers, yupiks, sheep-eaters, and slower lowers are, what frost heaves do, where the largest mass execution on American soil took place, when Michigan acquired its Upper Peninsula, and why there's no such thing as a Massachusettsean. And I know this, that the complete set of WPA guides that belonged to Alistair Cook is in good hands, our writers. In the middle of commissioning pieces from our 50 writers, Sean bought the set from a bookseller who kindly took a shine to our undertaking. We shipped them off to our contributors to inspire their work, and we hope the great curiosity about America and American lives those magnificent guides evince is evident in their essays. State by State may not be the great storehouse of facts that Kazin declared the WPA guides to be, but we hope it will, in time, live up to the words that another critic, Malcolm Cowley, once bestowed on the Federal Writers Project itself: a rowdy, idealistic, sometimes farcical experiment that refuses to be forgotten. Introduction. State by State. Sean Wilsey. In the fall of 2002, I set out to drive a 1960 Chevy Apache 10 pickup truck at 45 miles per hour from far west Texas to New York City. 2,364 miles through desert, suburbs, forests, lake-spattered plains, mountains, farmland, more suburbs, and the Holland Tunnel. A year before this drive, the planes had hit the World Trade Center, 20 blocks from my apartment. And in the months before and after that, my best friend from childhood had died. My best friend from adolescence had died. My senior-most aunt had died. The man I'd long thought of as a father and my actual father had died. I thought a long, slow drive across much of America would allow me to catch up with these losses. But I wasn't going alone. My traveling companions were an architect named Michael Meredith and a dog named Charlie Chaplin. Michael and I had become friends in Marfa, Texas, the town where the minimalist artist Donald Judd exiled himself in the 1970s from the glib and harsh New York art scene in 2000, when Michael was in town designing a house for Judd's longtime partner, and my wife and I were guests of the Lannan Foundation, each working on a book. Michael left for a teaching job back east, and my wife and I stayed on. That's when I first saw the truck in front of the post office. Boxy, banged up, covered in sky blue house paint, half-smashed windshield, a lattice of stars and linear cracks like a flag. A Mexican man in his 60s walked outside with his mail and drove it away. Then I biked around town till I found it parked out by the cemetery. Jesse Santesteban, the owner, showed me where he'd signed the engine compartment like an artist and said that I could take a closer look. The doors had handmade wooden armrests, and the seat belts were fashioned of canvas and chain link. An orange shag carpet covered the floorboards. I offered him $1,200 cash. He handed over a green plastic keychain that read, "Laugh, live, love, and be happy," and warned, "Don't take it over 45, or it'll throw a rod." A friend later explained, "That's a polite way of saying the engine will explode." My wife and I adopted Charlie around the same time. When we took him back to New York a couple months later, I left the truck, which Jesse agreed to look after. 2 years on, Charlie, now quite big, and I flew back in order to try and drive this piece of folk art come death trap, which had never gone farther than the nearby town of Pecos, across the country, seeing America slowly, a way almost nobody gets or wants to see it. Driving slow both satisfied and ran contrary to my instinct to flee, and, pleasingly to my mind, it made fun of the two main preoccupations of our entire country, velocity and ease. Not that I didn't appreciate velocity in particular. The will to speed had long been one of my defining characteristics. On a road trip a few years prior, I tried to set a car's cruise control at 140 miles per hour. Now I would piss off and get passed by everyone, including a guy hauling hay and a wide-load trailer pulling a house. I almost passed a school bus in Arkansas, but when the sleepy driver spotted me, he floored it. I would be the slowest person in America. Marfa is surrounded by one of the few untouched landscapes remaining in the lower 48, a high desert formed in the Permian period and left more or less alone in the 250 million years since. All roads out of town lead across empty yellow grasslands, through blue sage and cactus-covered mountains, where the traveler's only company is the weather. A hailstorm once blackened the sky behind me, caught up, dented my hood, starred my windshield, covering the pavement in ice cubes, and moved on into the distance. At night the stars glowed like phosphorescence in the sea and were as abundant as static on a broken TV. At 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, I honked the horn in front of a small adobe where Michael had spent the night with some friends. It was a clear sound in the dry desert air. On the phone, we'd planned out the trip as follows. Always take back roads, eat only in non-chains, never hurry, spend a day in San Antonio meeting a man I'll call Don Harris, for whom Michael might design a house, potentially his first to be built, write songs to perform at an open mic in Nashville. Charlie would ride in the bed of the truck, and we would have the cab. I tied his long leash to the truck's roll bar so he'd know not to jump out. Michael looked like an architect, thin with thick glasses, black pants, and a white shirt, the two colors separated by a belt with a brushed steel buckle. He'd met Charlie, but this was his first look at the truck. "Hello, Charles," he said to Charlie, then remarked, "I like the shotgun rack." "Yeah," I said. "It's also good for keeping umbrellas." He stared. "No, man, umbrellas? What kind of wuss-ass keeps umbrellas in his shotgun rack?" Before I could answer, he noticed the stick shift. "Oh, shit. I didn't sleep all night because I was worried about that. I can't drive stick." "What?" "Sorry, I didn't think it would be a stick shift. It's American. Everything's easy in America." "It's from 1960. I figured I could teach him. There was nothing to hit out in the desert. Then he told me he had to be in San Antonio by 9 a.m. the next day to meet Don, his potential client. San Antonio was just under 400 miles away. I'd been thinking we'd reach Del Rio, half the distance, following along the Rio Grande. You know we can only go 45. "What? Come on. You're joking, right?" "No, really. Look at this thing," I said. Michael took in the ancient interior and medieval seatbelts. "Can you call and say that we'll get there around noon?" "I only have his email. I just told him we'd be there." "Well," I said, "we'll keep driving till we make it." Partially out of courtesy, I didn't want to tell him the engine would explode. As Jack Kerouac said about himself and Neil Cassidy, his friend and driving companion in On the Road, we tiptoed around each other like heartbreaking new friends. From the Marfa grasslands east through the Glass Mountains, we made the town of Alpine, 30-odd miles away, in 45 minutes. The gas gauge fell by a third. Afraid there wasn't a lot of gas in the next leg, we decided to buy 2 6-gallon jerry cans, along with tools, water, and food. I should mention here the weird coincidence that we were driving our way through a book I'd never read, John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, wherein, I've now read it, the author and his dog, Charlie, lit out on the back roads of America in the fall of 1960 in a new GM pickup in order to rediscover this monster land. Steinbeck is precise and prescient about America, observing that there will come a time when we can no longer afford our wastefulness, chemical wastes in the rivers, metal wastes everywhere, and atomic wastes buried deep in the earth or sunk in the sea. And in a letter Steinbeck wrote to Adlai Stevenson, quoted in J. Perini's introduction, he makes the dead-on assessment that as a country, we can stand anything God and nature throw at us, save only plenty. If I wanted to destroy a nation, I would give it too much, and I would have it on its knees, miserable, greedy, and sick. But I engaged in no such musing as we made our way east, too absorbed with correcting the steering, an act of constant attention. Around lunchtime, we'd made it 70 more miles. We stopped outside the town of Marathon and filled up the tank again. A lean old man touched his cowboy hat, pointed at the truck, and said, "65?" Michael replied, "Yep." And the man walked away. I said, "It's a 60, actually." Michael said, "Yeah, but why bother correcting somebody? He doesn't care what year it is, really. He just wants to feel like he knows something. Now he feels good." We were on a slow...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?